Hello, everybody. Just a really quick greeting today, and I did want to compliment you again, one and all, on everything you did last week in the forums. I was so pleased with the results of the forum question and the paper preparation. You all are doing a great job. Today I've uploaded for you a paper on Psalm 19 that I wrote a couple of years ago. It's actually been published since then, and it's called Creation, Creator, and Conceptual Metaphor. So what I wanted to highlight was one of the literary features that you may come up with, and how a literary feature called, any of the literary features actually can be kind of affected by this idea of conceptual metaphor. Conceptual metaphor entails compare and contrast in our own mind, and it actually is another work by analogy of comparing one thing and describing it in terms of another. And you can turn in this paper to what is page 49 from the actual book it was printed in, to find section number 3, the extended great chain of being as a source for conceptual metaphor. And I think once we think through this, you'll see that you yourself probably do these comparisons on a fairly regular basis, even if it doesn't have anything to do with a literary metaphor. So the basic idea goes back to kind of a folk theory or a common way of thinking of how things are related to each other in the world. And this actual quote in the paper comes from someone called Zoltan Kovacs, and his book called Metaphor, A Practical Introduction is excellent for understanding conceptual metaphor. Often in literature, this gets played out as literary metaphor, but sometimes we can see, even in our own world today, that comparisons are made in advertisements and writings, in pictures and photos, and that kind of thing that tend to also play on this idea of conceptual metaphor. In other words, understanding one thing in terms of another. So let's look at one of the concepts here called the extended great chain of being. This has been around for a long time, but it kind of outlines a little bit of how we tend to put things in order. And this is extended because we've added here the idea of God. So I'm looking now at page 51 at the diagram, and at the top of this chain is God in Jewish Christian tradition. And that in the Genesis story is the creator of the universe. Then the next item down would be the cosmos, or the universe itself, described in Genesis in days 1 through 4. And then we get down to society, which is a big group, but a big group of human beings. And these society itself can be understood in a couple of different ways. And these metaphors that we use are actually kind of abstract, complex metaphors at that point. So they tend to deal with systems rather than individual human beings. Then we move down to the idea of humans, which have higher order attributes and behavior. These were created on day 6 in Genesis. And then the animals, who act on instinct and exhibit instinctual attributes of behavior, created on day 6, along with the land, or to fill the land, and then also the sea and the sky on day 5. We have plants that exhibit biological attributes and behavior, not normally made into caricatures, but sometimes they are, on day 3. Then we move to complex objects, such as things that have structural attributes and can have functional behavior. In other words, a table, a chair, those have structural attributes, but they're not animate in and of themselves. And then natural physical things that do their own thing, so to speak. We're thinking of rocks, we're thinking of water even. Water moves, but it does it because that's the natural physical attribute of water. It's not animate in the sense of having a soul per se. So I've also included a second diagram called the animacy hierarchy. Okay, linguists will use this, and we've already been talking in these terms in our course, talking about different speech act participants. And so I've outlined this as participant 1, in other words, the most important one, speech act number 2, speech act number 3. And we can then move to proper nouns, in other words, names for people. We can talk about animate objects, inanimate objects, or simple mass. Okay, so those two charts tend to work kind of hand in hand with them. Now, the extended great chain is not in and of itself a metaphor system. it becomes metaphorical when we use one level to understand another level. If we use humans to understand plants, for example, we could say that we've now become making them analogous with one another in a certain way, and we've now used a conceptual metaphor. Okay, so cognitive construal such as this is evident in both Genesis A, which is the creation story, and Genesis B, which is the story of Adam and Eve, because in these accounts God exhibits attributes and behavior credited to humans. Okay, and I've had interesting talks with people about the idea of anthropomorphic discussion of God, and then the idea of anthropopathic discussion of God. In other words, God is having emotions. And we've talked about trying to reverse that. If we're created in the image of God, is it not the case that we have characteristics of God, as rather than becoming describers of God in terms of anthropological characteristics? And I discovered via a Facebook conversation with several former students that this actually gets us into theological hot water rather quickly. So it is something interesting to think of. But for now, we can think of this as literary or conceptual metaphor meant to help to explain one thing in terms of another. In other words, we understand what it means to be human from our own experience. We don't understand what it means to be creator God from his perspective, but we can sort of look at certain characteristics we see and understand them in terms of ourselves. For example, here we have the idea of God walking in the garden. He walks and talks with Adam in the garden. It sounds like they're having a chat man to man, so to speak. Genesis A, however, has God speaking things into existence, which of course is something no human has ever done and will ever do. And that's a very different kind of view of God